Okay, well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I do apologize for sitting down. You should never really do that when lecturing, but I'm not as well as I should be, and I kind of need to. And they told me they wanted the camera to be either down or up, but not both. So, to start with, you can see that? Yes. This lecture is a disorganized mess because it was finished about half an hour ago. And it would have been done sooner, except for the fact that most of yesterday and part of the day before, I was in the hospital. And so we'll get to what that was about later on. But as a result, the lecture is not as good as it should be. So I'm going to talk about my experience with interactive storytelling as, part of my larger career, and then how I brought that experience to Gotland and began teaching it here and learned things from my students and from the entire process that I thought were interesting. My own growth began by being a voracious reader as a kid. There were no iPads to distract me. And I read Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, H. Rider Haggard, and lots of science fiction. And I wrote stories when I was a kid as well, because I thought that was a fun and exciting thing to do. And I taught myself programming in Fortran, no less, as a teenager. And then I took creative writing in high school. And so that was just an elective class that I had the opportunity to take. And then at university, I was a philosophy major, but the philosophy department was well aware that you can't get a job with a philosophy degree. And so they had lots and lots of spare time in the curriculum for you to go off and take electives. And so I studied creative writing and poetry and playwriting in addition to philosophy. And it was at university that I encountered adventure, also known as Colossal Cave, which I hope you've all heard of. And, was very, very excited by that. One of the very first interactive stories, so to speak, although it didn't have much of a plot. And I had a 1-unit class. The ordinary workload is 15 units. I had a 1-unit class to teach me Pascal. And I decided that the final project in that should be an adventure game, which is rather excessive for just 1 point. But I did it anyway because I had a good time. Continuing on, I moved on first into the electronics industry and then into the game industry. And in the game industry, I was one of the early organizers of the Game Developers Conference. And in those early days, we thought 500 attendees was a good number. And the Game Developers Conference is now up to about 25,000. So, and I moved into the industry as a programmer and was thinking all along about interactive storytelling at the same time and sort of the background because I wasn't being paid for that. And in 1995, I gave a lecture at the conference where I identified some key problems that I felt we'd been fighting over for years. There was a great deal of argument in the game industry about, whether we should do stories and how we should do them and, how they can be organized and, is it worth it and so forth and so on. And so I identified these problems and gave this lecture there. And one of them was the problem of coherency. How do you make sure that the story remains coherent when the player may have ideas that are different from your own and, will go off in other directions? How do you guarantee that the player will arrive at the narrative climax when the narrative climax happens? What happens if they're not ready when the climax is ready? Or, how do you deal with that? And then the problem of amnesia, the fact that the player really knows nothing about the world that he or she has gone into. And, it's rather odd in video games that the first thing you do is go open up all the drawers in your apartment to see what's in them. Because, you have amnesia about the world that you've just been dropped into. And our methods for dealing with this are really quite clumsy. And so I was trying to think of, how we can improve that. After some years in the game industry, I became a consultant, and then I went and got a PhD in interactive storytelling at the University of Teesside in the UK for having solved these problems. I wrote my PhD on what I found was the solution to these problems and a number of other issues. And I want to mention a concept that was originally raised by Janet Murray at the Georgia Tech, the well-formed story, the qualities that define, a good story, a story that we recognize as acceptable, and that if they don't contain these things, then you recognize that the story has a problem. So you don't want absurdities. You don't want to bump into any events that occur before their causes. And there are video games that do this. You run into a thing and you say, what in the world is this? I don't see what this is here for. And then 15 minutes later, you find the cause that goes with the event that you saw. And it was just that you somehow were able to see things in a backward order. And that was because the player had too much freedom, or they were able to pass through a part of the landscape that they weren't really supposed to get through. So that's not supposed to happen in a good story. No repetitive events. You don't want the same event to happen again and again and again in a story. Now it's peculiar because that happens all the time in games. There's no game more repetitive than Risk, right? But in stories, if you're just reading a story in a magazine, you wouldn't tolerate it if it was just the same thing again. No boring periods. Dramatic tension needs to be maintained. You can tolerate a certain amount of boredom in longer things like novels, but on the whole, you want it to move right along. And again, games can get into these kind of stuck periods where nothing is happening and they're boring. So, you have to deal with that. No incoherent or incredible content. I attended a conference some years ago where I realized that there was a meaningful concept called a credibility budget. And every story has a credibility budget that, beyond it, you just throw down the book and say, I'm not reading this nonsense, or in my case, very frequently, it's switching off the TV. This is rubbish. I simply don't believe it. Or it's incoherent. There's stuff that doesn't belong in here. It's got content that doesn't fit with what's in there. No Deus ex machina. You don't want the gods to come down from the sky and just solve all the problems. And characters maintain their identity. They don't suddenly turn into other characters. Now, they can if there's a sort of a reason for it, if you're a vampire and it turns into a bat or something like that. But on the whole, a person should, their character should remain, who they say they are throughout, except in cases of disguise. And that was an idea that I realized here on Gotland. So it's one of the things that came about sort of late in my career. And I want to introduce you to rule number 1 of composition, and that is all content in a story must either illuminate character, establish the setting, or advance the plot. And if you are writing something that doesn't do one of those 3 things, you really need to question why. Because, it is possible to go rambling off about other stuff, but it's not necessarily what the reader wants. And so if you really want to tighten up your work and be careful and sure that it is, providing a tight-knit story, then illuminate character, establish setting, or advance the plot. Just put that test on every sentence. And if you've got some sentence that's wandering off and doesn't do one of those things, you might want to ask yourself why. And I learned this from my wife, who is a professional editor. And she's edited some of my books and is incredibly hard-nosed and knows all kinds of stuff. And one of the things that I realized along the process of all these fights that we were having in the early years of the game industry is that any game can contain an interactive story, because they can vary a lot. And there was a lot of fighting over what is an interactive story, and it must be like this, or it must be like that, or whatever. And I concluded that, in fact, it's a story if it feels like one. It's a story if it has an inciting incident, if it has rising action, if it has a climax, falling action, and a conclusion, as Walter Freytag said, basing his work on what Aristotle said about Greek plays. So, even Ms. Pac-Man has a little story in it. There's not much to it, but it's used in Ms. Pac-Man as a way of showing the player something to keep them busy while it's loading the next level. And that's what it was for there, was just to take up a little time while it loads the next level. And so they devised this little romance between Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man that showed up. And so that's one thing that you can do with an interactive story in a game, is just use it as a level transition, And if you've ever played StarCraft, you know that after the level is over, then you go to these three guys looking out of TV screens and yakking and yakking and yakking at each other with background stuff that you really don't care about very much. But, that's what they've put in for their level transition. And then, another level starts and you go on and play that. So, and there's all kinds. You can go on up to, full-sized adventure games where the plot is the entire point of the experience. You go around exploring and bumping into things and solving puzzles and experiencing the plot, and that's the motivation for playing it, down to just real trivialities like Ms. Pac-Man. So, all kinds of things can be interactive stories, and so there's no need for fighting over them anymore. Another thing I did, and once I began to come to this realization, is I developed a requirement specification for thinking about interactive stories. Because too many people, and I worked at Electronic Arts for many years, will start an interactive storytelling project without knowing why they're doing it and what they want to accomplish. They think, we're going to put a story into this role-playing game. But we don't really know what we're going to do or what it's going to mean or how it's going to tie into the gameplay. We're going to do something, but we're not really sure what. And so Bard's Tale 4 went on for 4 years and spent $2.5 million, which was a lot of money back then. And then it just got canceled because the producer just couldn't make up his mind about what he really wanted to do, and he just, the whole thing fell apart, and the company finally said, we're killing this thing. And I realized that you need to think through why you want an interactive story in your game at all, because there might be circumstances under which there's no point. Tetris does not require an interactive story. It just doesn't, and so don't bother. And if you try to shove one in there, you would just, you just waste a lot of time and money. So a requirement specification allows you to clarify what it is that you're actually seeking to achieve. What are the emotional outcomes that you want to generate in the player? What are the experiences you want them to have, and so on, and work it through. Now, this is not a document that I created for writing the story. This is not for writing the story at all. This is actually a template for figuring out what kind of a story it's going to be. And a requirement specification for a work of art may sound really odd, right? But in fact, I was in the electronics industry before I went into the game industry, and I know why we do requirement specifications. It's so we know what we're trying to achieve before we start spending money on it, before we work our way into it. And so I wrote a template for how to define a requirement specification for an interactive story. And it's available on my website. It's open source. You're welcome to take it and do anything you want to with it. But it consists of a series of questions to ask yourself. What is the player's relationship with the avatar? Is the avatar somebody totally invisible and transparent, like Gordon Freeman, that you never actually see? Or are they a highly personalized, characterized character that, has a vocabulary of their own and an attitude of their own and clothing of their own and so on and so forth, like, say, Lara Croft, or somebody in between, like Mario, So and that's just one of the many dozens of questions that the requirement specification includes. And not long after I developed the requirement specification, I moved to Gotland because it was amazingly beautiful, and because the chairman of the Department of Game Design at Högskola på Gotland at the time, Stephen Batchelder, bothered me again and again to come out here. And he actually went to the Game Developers Conference to look me up and try and persuade me to come and teach here. And so I did. And I realized that this was really a wonderful department. And back when it was Högskola på Gotland, it was a really wild and crazy department. Now that we've joined Uppsala, it's become rather more academic and staid. So I came, and I taught all kinds of things. And eventually, I began to teach the interactive storytelling class. So I'm going to talk to you about that. These were some of the challenges I met in teaching interactive storytelling here. The class is an elective, and anyone from the university may attend, as far as I'm aware. And this includes students from outside the department, of course. And that means there are no guarantees that any of them will be programmers. And no guarantees that any of them will be artists. And no guarantees that any of them will be writers. And so most students, I realized this with a great shock about halfway through one of these courses, most students had never had a creative writing course. I don't know what they teach your kids in high school, but apparently it's not creative writing. And so I interrupted the course, and I suddenly went back to Aristotle, and I said, okay, let me tell you about Greek drama, and how that works, and then we're going to move on to Walter Freytag and Shakespeare, and how we move forward from Greek drama to later forms, and so on and so forth, and the various things that are required for telling a story, for a narrative. And I took about 2 weeks to do that in the middle of my interactive storytelling course, just so that people would know what it was that they were actually trying to achieve, because a fair number of people didn't. And then, there's a lot of concern right now in the academic world about plagiarism. Everybody is freaking about ChatGPT and what that's going to mean and do to us, and I had to think about that. But I've never noticed it to be a serious problem on Gotland, frankly. Maybe it is in other departments, but I've never noticed it to be a serious problem in our department. And my class keeps getting larger. More and more people keep wanting to take it, which sounds like boasting on my part, but I need a teaching assistant. My boss is sitting right here in the front row. I either need a teaching assistant or I need to cut it down to an upper maximum. So I arrived at certain solutions. I figured out how to make programming-free assignments and to make art-free assignments, and to start by teaching a little creative writing. So in the second year, I put the creative writing up front, and I spent some time on that so that people had an understanding of the structure of a story, that it goes up like this, and then it hits a climax, and it goes down like this, unless it's a long novel, in which case it goes up and down, and up and down, and up and down, and so forth, until you get to Frodo reaches Mount Doom. But on the way to Mount Doom, he has several places to rest along the way, And I also talk about character design, and I talk about introducing people to settings and so on. And this is another thing that we do in the video game industry rather poorly, is that we say, you are in this place. And, look around and you see this, that, and the other, and so on, and it's just kind of a information dump. And in fact, very often, as I said, you have to go around and look in your apartment and see what's there, just to know what's going on. Or you get voiceover that talks yak, 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 or you get scrolling text, And there's even scrolling text at the beginning of the original Star Wars movie. So, it is kind of a legitimate thing to do. But, we've moved on beyond that for the most part in video games. And now we've started doing tutorials. And the tutorials let you see what the environment looks like without having to give you scrolling text. I did once play a Japanese game where, so help me, I just pressed the go on button for 20 solid minutes. As there was all this text that I had to read before I could go on. And also applying those rules about, what makes a well-formed story. So I teach them to the students and say, it's got to be like this, or it's going to be a bad story. So set the scene, illustrate character, advance the plot. Don't do anything else unless you have an extremely good reason for it. And the other solution is to beg for help from the department for a little more assistance. So the first big assignment that I gave, my unplagiarizable assignment, is rather odd, and I've never seen any other one like it. This is how it works. You're going to create a single-player, turn-based, player versus environment board game. So it's a board game, but there's only one player. And it's sometimes a single person makes this, and sometimes it's a group of two. The player's role in this game can be pretty much anything. Now, I'm talking to the students here, of course. The students who are building this game can decide what the player's role is going to be: an explorer, a detective, an escaping prisoner, or whatever. And as the player moves around the board, the game is generating a story. So every square contains story content. There's a card in each square face down. And as the player steps into that square, they turn it over and find out what is happening in that square. And the goal is to make the experience feel continuously story-like for the player while still offering the players some control, because they get to decide where to step, right, from square to square. There's two possible versions of this. There's an easy one and a hard one. The hard one, the board is 7 by 7, and the player starts in the center square and works their way outwards. And so the center square is a prologue. So they always start there, and the squares are not randomized. They're set up in advance by the game developers, and the center square is the prologue, and so they start there and they turn that over, and that tells them, what's going on. And then it ends when the player goes off the edge. So if they get to the edge of the board, the ending happens when they step off. The easier version, the board is 6 by 9. And the player starts at one end and they go to the other end. So they're not starting in the middle and going any which way. They're going from here to there, which is a lot easier for the developers to make a natural, Freytag's triangle in, because it's straight. Now, which one of these was the button? Oh, here we go. Was that it? Yes. Okay. So the easy one, and for this class I said, if you do the easy one, you can get a G, but if you do the hard one, you can get a VG. There was a fuss at that point about grading being objective. And people said, I don't want a subjective grade. I want to know precisely what it takes to get a VG. And so I said, okay, if you do the hard one, then you can have a VG. So the player starts off the board at one end, the player goes to the other end, and every square is associated with a content that contains story content. The layout of the board is fixed, except that 12 squares may be randomized. So they can, for 12 of the squares, they can draw a deck from a stack of random events. So this is what the board looks like. And these are the starting and ending positions, and the player just starts from one and goes to the other end. And the developers can put walls in to constrain the player's movement to a degree. And this is sort of necessary to make sure that they don't create absurdities, that they don't accidentally run into an effect before they hit the cause. So by putting in walls, you can put a limited number, but they're not supposed to put in too many. They're not supposed to just, force the player down to a single path. So there are rules about how many walls they can put in. And the player movement, looks like this. They just move around step by step, and every time they do, they turn over the card and see what it is and read it. And they set the card off to one side, and as they get new cards, they make a stack. And if they step back through a space that they already went through, then just nothing happens there. They've already seen that event. And so they just move on. And the story events go into a pile, and then the actual test of this assignment is I read the story back at the end. I don't care whether they win or they lose, they get to the end or not. What matters is, was the story any good? And that's going to depend on how well they laid out those cards in such a way that when the player went through them, it generated a decent story. And and they don't know where the player is going to go except through the limitations of the walls. So it's really tough, to make sure that they all produce a meaningful sequence that is narrative-like, that is story-like. And it's way harder if the player starts in the middle and works their way out in any direction, because you just really don't know what they're going to do. But you can decorate the board, and you can indicate that it's, some kind of a space, and in between the walls, you can, say that this is, we've got a sort of a suburban zone. There's a house, and there's a driveway and woods and some parking and a meadow and a jungle, a ruined fort, and so on. You can set the game to any scale you want. You can put it in a galaxy, or you can put it in an anthill, whatever you like. And this helps to set the feeling of the place, and to give the player an enjoyment about where they are, and so forth. Then the hard version looks like this, with you in the middle. You still have walls, and the player moves around as usual, and you get story events as usual, as I've explained before. And the end condition is to leave, but the developers don't know where they're going to leave either, and so they have to decide, well, what is going to be the ending of this story, and is it going to be based on did they get away successfully, or which side did they get away off of, or are they carrying the magic sword? Because they're also allowed to have other characters, and they're also allowed to have objects that they can carry around, and they're allowed to have attributes and stuff like that. I tell the students not to put in too much work into all that stuff. I don't want them to turn it into D&D, because the job is to come up with a decent story. But if they need to have a sword, or some attributes or health or something like that, that's allowed. And and they can decorate this too. So I've already explained all this. After the game is over, they're read back to see the story of the player's adventure, and the story should be good no matter what the player does, with rising tension and a climax. Some other mechanics. I said you can add NPCs, you can include movable objects, and the cards may contain if statements. So if you have the knife, then, that kind of thing. And I strongly urge you to keep the player's stats simple. One more rule: no death without warning. I'm really against insta-death in video games. And you have to meet all the requirements of a decent story, The second big assignment for the introduction to interactive storytelling is a Twine assignment. And Twine is this wonderful free drag and drop text adventure generation tool. You can get it at twinery.org. And it has a programming language built into it. It's rather obscure, but I do not require that you use it. So you can make Twine games with just links between passages of text. So you see a little passage of text, you read it, and then there's links that move you on to another passage of text. It's also possible to put in pictures, but I don't require them either. So the assignment is to make a Twine game that has 75 passages. So these are essentially paragraphs, long or short. Some of them are incredibly long. One conversation with at least 3 interchanges, because I want you to talk to other people and build in meaningful dialogue. A defined avatar with some characterization. So I don't want you to just have a transparent, meaningless character. A defined setting. I don't want you to just be in space. And every 4th passage, the player must have a choice. So no just going on and on and on in a straight line, right? The story must branch. And this is what the Twine workspace looks like. It's as I said, drag and drop, and you just put in links after every passage or within the passage if you want to. And when the player clicks on the link, they move to another passage and they read some more. And the output of Twine, the Twine tool produces HTML files, which means that you can run the stories in any browser. And there's a debugging mode if you use code. So you can use the debugger. And you can have variables that store information about where the player's gone and what they're carrying and all that jazz. This is another thing I learned on Gotland. I'd never heard of Twine before I got here. And here is a screenshot of what the gameplay looks like. It's just white text, and then the links are blue text underneath, and each of these 3 blue lines is a choice, a place where you can go, and then you'll get a new passage, and eventually you come to a passage with no more links, and that's the end of the story. And you can, you can go back to places you've already been, but then that means that you see something again, and that really shouldn't happen because remember the rule against repetition. So really, on the whole, I prefer that they just go onwards and onwards. Now, advanced interactive storytelling. That was a new one for me 2 years ago, and I said I would like to teach an advanced interactive storytelling, and the faculty said, it's your funeral. So these were my goals for the advanced class. We looked at the history of folklorism and the study of how we began to recognize structure in stories. And this was done by the folklorists who were traveling around Europe and identifying the structure of folklore. Vladimir Prop in Russia figured out that Russian folk tales all had a very standard structure. Saussure was studying folk tales, and of course so was Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm, and Tolkien was a folklorist as well. And as you look at the structure of stories and novels and other things, you can consider them through various sorts of lenses. So Saussure and Prop were looking at structure, but other people are looking at them through other modes, such as feminist, Marxist, post-colonialist, postmodernist. This is how people feel about these stories as they read them through a particular lens. So, you can read Little Red Riding Hood, through a feminist lens about, the oppression of little girls by big bad wolves and so forth. And what I wanted to do primarily for the advanced class was to examine multiplayer interactive storytelling, which is really hard. Multiplayer interactive storytelling, suddenly you run into questions about, well, exactly whose plot is this? How are we going to organize this in such a way that they're all moving around, they're all having these experiences, they have to make sense, They still have to meet the requirements of a good story, and there are a number of ways to do it. One way is the sort of Japanese RPG way, where they all get together in a party and they move around together in a lump, and you actually don't let them spread out, because that way you don't have to worry about multiple plots starting to wander and go in different places. If you have party-based role-playing, then everybody's together in one place, and you know that you're going to have a plot that continues to make sense. That's one way to do it. But you might have several different people wandering around in different places, and it has to make sense and so forth. So we looked into multiplayer interactive storytelling. And then the other big assignment was automated interactive story generation. And this is something that is very exciting right now. There's people in AI working on it, trying to figure out how to create interactive stories through some kind of algorithmic mechanism. This is procedurally generated stories. But I wanted to make procedurally generated interactive stories, which is even harder. And so I found a way to do it, and I'm going to, in the next 8 minutes, try to get them across. You have a game master who's going to devise an algorithm for choosing passages that are interesting passages on the basis of what has already come before. So a story is emerging, a passage at a time, out of a big box of little cards that have passages on them. And the game master, which someday may be an AI algorithm, is looking in the big box of possible passages to choose the next one that will fit in with what has come before to make it generate a good story. And also to keep an eye on those rules. So they won't pick a passage that is non-credible, that is undesirable or absurd, that is repetitious, and so on, and prevent that from happening. Some of the challenges of the events class: the class is an elective. Anybody might turn up. It should only include students who have already taken regular interactive storytelling, but it doesn't. And for some reason, advanced interactive storytelling occurs in the schedule before regular interactive storytelling, so it's completely backwards. And this year, I actually had some people do that. They took advanced, then they took regular. And I thought, or I had been told, that it's supposed to be a master's degree class, which I thought would guarantee a certain amount of background, but no, it's not. Still no guarantee of any programmers, still no guarantee of any artists, still no guarantee of any writers. Yours true has to deal with this. They may have done some in other classes. Solutions: make programming free assignments. Make art free assignments. Start by teaching creative writing. Apply the rules. Set the scene, illustrate character, activate the plot. Apply well-formedness. So here's the first big advanced assignment. It's the board game, but it's the same board game. It's the hard one, 7 by 7, but it's a 4-person group project. But it has 4 players, and they move throughout a common space. Same rule about moving through a space already visited. Each player generates a story, so you flip over the little cards. The rules of good stories still apply, and so the people start in the corners, and they can move around, and the story events occur, and each player generates their own story. So you have 4 little piles, right? And at the end, I, the game master, read the way back through the little piles to see if they're good, right? And if they're not good, then, they get failed. Not really. They don't get failed, but, I'm hoping for good stuff. And, they can decorate it. I had one absolutely fabulous one out of the last year's class from this. 4 different players were acting as detectives at 4 different points in time in a single town. So they broke up the town into 4 zones, but each zone was a different season in the same town. And each detective was investigating a crime that had happened across the whole town at different times of the year. And it was awesome. I'm about to cry. They got a VG. Okay, 4 minutes left. The second big advanced assignment is this card-based automatic story generator. This one does not have a board. I've looked into what's been going on with automatic story generation, and most of the AI story generators are neural nets that create absolute crap. And some of them have been, they search to see what words follow what other words in English, and it's just the same thing over and over. And somebody's posted an example that said, and they were slain, and they were slain, and they used their swords, and they were slain, and they were slain, and they were slain. And it was because, that's the word that was just used again and again. And it's garbage. But, that was all the neural net was noticing. Or they use old-fashioned, I say old-fashioned now, it's from the 90s, rule-based expert systems to try and generate stories that, that obeyed rules and would produce sensible, meaningful things. Little Red Riding Hood, has to meet the wolf first, and so forth. And it knows that there are certain rules that must be followed in order for it to make sense, because the rules of the system will not make sense, and so they are ruled out if you try to generate a story, and the rules prohibit. They prohibit those absurdities, for example, of seeing the event before the cause. So, rule-based systems for stories, they don't generate necessarily good stories. And the problem is, I'm being mean to AI people now, but these AI people have never taken a creative writing class. They don't know the rules of creative writing. So my goal was to apply the rules of well-formed stories and creative writing to automated generation. So the stories are interactive with intermittent player choices, but they don't offer a lot of agency, okay? These stories offer the player, there is a player, and from time to time they get a card with some choices on it, but not very frequently. So this is what's going on, and I hope you can see this. Oh, I've got 1 minute, damn. 2, okay. You've got a set of piles of different cards. And one pile is introductions with settings and characterization. The next one is inciting incidents. Remember, these are features of creative writing. Then there's pre-climax events. This is all rising action. Then there are climaxes. This is pow, this is the big excitement at the middle of the story. Then there's post-climax events, and then there's endings. Okay, so the game master, or the AI, if it ever happens, is choosing from these, and when they move on from the next pile to the next pile, then they can't go backwards. If you've had the climax, you can't go back to pre-climax events anymore. And the idea, I asked my students to create 50 of these. So it's a relatively small batch, right? But the idea is to be like Trivial Pursuit and have, a huge box of hundreds of them, and that are about all kinds of things. And so they're pulling these cards and showing them to the player, and every now and then the player will have a choice, and the choices will cause one of these consequence events, which are down below, to get stuck into the piles. So you can either have a direct, immediate consequence that says, oh, you've done something that's going to have an effect right now, or you have an inferred or delayed consequence where the player has made a decision that is, they don't know what it means, but later on down the line, it's going to have an effect on them. So the deferred consequence is going to go into one of the stacks up above. And so, if you decided to pick the firearm instead of the sword, then later on, that's going to have a consequence for your story. And as the story goes on, it gets piled up into a resulting story. I get kicked off. So you have these event cards, and they have choices at the bottom, if there are any choices. And there's a passage in the middle that is what happened at the moment. In this, Dave realized that he didn't bring enough water on his hike, and he's going to be in trouble. There's some attributes associated with this. The dramatic tension went up by 2 points because he realizes he's running out of water. But credibility does not change. It's 0. That's a reasonably credible thing to have happen. On the other hand, if Dave on his hike runs into a dinosaur, that's like a +10. His credibility is totally shot because this is set in the present day. There's also a category that says travel. And you can have these, that's a way of documenting card for card what this card is about, so that the algorithm cannot choose too many of them in a row. Because a good story doesn't go on and on with the same kind of material again and again and again, right? You don't just want to have the endless content of the same sort of material. You want to switch up between running away and combat and travel and rest and all those things. And so there's a category marker on each card to keep track of that. And there's a marker that says this is a pre-climax card, so put that in the pre-climax stack, so that you know where to sort them out when you get them out of the box. I have a last thing to say to you, and that is that I may never teach these courses again, because I don't know. I hope to. I really do hope to be able to get to, but I have end-stage renal disease, and that's a fancy way of saying I'm sitting here with dead kidneys. And what is keeping me alive is one of these. It is a home peritoneal dialysis machine, and it cleans out my bloodstream every night. Unfortunately, it takes quite a while to set this darn thing up. I was very pleased that it could do it at night, so I would have the day, but it turns out it takes quite a while in the day to set up the bags full of fluids and take them down and blah, 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 blah. And I had a really hard year this year. Meeting my students' expectations and getting all the work done. And I hope that I get better as time goes on, but I might not. And in that case, this will be it. And I will be saying goodbye to you all. So thank you for your patience, and goodbye.